Hey everybody, welcome back to another Monday night live reading. Tonight I'm going to be reading from Patrick Ness's excellent short novel, A Monster Calls. You can see here from the cover and the title. One of the interesting things about this book is that it would seem to have been designed by the book designer and the illustrator. It's illustrated, but the illustrations are not necessary to the text. They just took this interesting kind of graphic novel approach to it, where they made it look a little bit like a graphic novel, even though the text stands alone. So I'm going to read from the back to give you an explanation of what this is. I'm going to comment on it for a minute, but I just want to give you a little bit of a flavor of the book. My daughter gave this to me for my birthday, I think, or for Christmas a couple of years ago, and I read it and was like, this is a really well done story. So there's illustrations like this throughout that are, it's all black and white. It has a kind of watercolor look to it. I'm not really a graphic artist or anything, so I can't comment on that stuff, but very interesting illustrations. And in places, there's even, here's another good illustration. The text is white on the black illustration instead of just black on white. And then in other places you get, illustrations off into the corner of the text here. But so it's very, very beautifully laid out book, and that's part of the fun of some books, which is why I like reading a physical copy of this rather than an ebook. I'm reading from A Monster Calls tonight because I think the text is the prose is really well done. It's very artistically created. It's a moving story, and it's not really horror. It's got the opening scene I'm going to read tonight might be a little scary. It's not really G-rated, so if you have younger kids in the room, just be aware of that. But it's not like, there's a monster in it, but it's pretty surprising in what the encounter that the boy has with the monster. It's not super scary or something, but it's probably PG. Anyway, the back of the book says, here's the description of the story. The monster showed up after midnight, as they do. But it isn't the monster Connor's been expecting. He's been expecting the one from his nightmare, the one he's had nearly every night since his mother started her treatments, the one with the darkness and the wind and the screaming. This monster is something different, though, something ancient, something wild, and it wants the most dangerous thing of all from Connor. It wants the truth. In a unique pairing of Carnegie Medal winners, Patrick Ness spins an extraordinarily moving tale of love, loss, and hope from the final idea of Siobhan Dowd, whose premature death from cancer prevented her from writing it herself. So you get an idea from that description. This isn't really a monster story. That said, it does have a lot of elements from fairy tales. And the only comment I'm really going to make about it tonight is just that I have been for the last, 5-6 months, something like that, I've been as a sort of hobby and occasionally rereading certain fairy tales, and I've been going through, Grimm's fairy tales and Hans Christian Andersen, and there are others, Irish fairy tales. There are so many fairy tales in the world. You could spend your whole lifetime just reading fairy tales and never like read the same one twice, or at least you could read several different versions of the same one and never be reading the same one twice, and you would still not get to the end of them. It's just this common human thing, and that's what I want to comment on tonight, that this has some of a fairy tale quality to it. Fairy tales often include monsters, and my comment tonight about that is simply that I think monsters represent something very human. I'm not a big fan of horror as a genre. I don't hate it, I just don't like to read it anymore. I read a lot of it when I was a kid, and I got kind of tired of fear being a thing. I just didn't like it as a driving motivation for a story or a driving emotion in a story. But fairy tales often use monsters, and I think the reason they use monsters comes back to the power of the fairy tale itself. So I talked about a little bit about this at the summer workshop, and I'm going to just take 2 or 3 minutes to make a point here that in case you're reluctant to listen to something like A Monster Calls, I think fairy tales get their power from the fact that they work on a different level for children than they do for adults. And often what the reason that makes them effective with children is that they're very simple. So everything is kind of told in black and white terms. They're not very long. They use repetitions of 3 often, and they will have a circularity to them that children understand as a storytelling type or a structure. But beyond that, they're almost always making a couple of really interesting points about growing up. And one of the interesting points that they often make is that there are things you should not do, that you're going to do anyway, but you shouldn't do them. And that's a moral point, right? And the reason I think that parents retell the same fairy tales is because parents have gone through the thing that they shouldn't have done, and then they've done it, right? And then they're going, I shouldn't have done that, and then they pass it on to their kids. That's why Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella and so many of the fairy tales that get retold, that's why I think they have endured. They've endured because there's an underlying message to them that's very subconscious, or you could say subliminal, but it's more like parents sort of get it, but it resonates with you as a human being, as a parent, in a way that other stories don't. And that's why I think there have been so many retellings of Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood and Hansel and Gretel, etc. Those stories have some common elements to them that are really profound. And I think there's something about this that kind of touches on those. It uses some of the same black and white things, the repetitions, the three tales that are within the story. And I don't want to give any spoilers for it, but if you like fairy tales, this might be one you like. It's as best I can tell, it's not really a retelling of something. It's more the author and the original person, Xiaoban Daoud. I don't know if I'm Xiaoban, I think, whose premature death from cancer prevented her from writing it herself. I think you can get the flavor of this book, that there's something deeply personal in both the Patrick Ness's version and the outline that was originally presented. And it just shows up in the story as this kind of hauntingly beautiful thing that's not really about fear. It's not really about monsters. It's about what the back of the book says: love, loss, and hope. It's about those three things. And those are three things that fairy tales might touch on. So that's my comment for tonight. I'm going to read just the first chapter. It's about, 18 pages, something like that. And there's some really marvelous illustrations in here, starting with the first chapter. The illustration you see on the first chapter is the monster off in the distance. And I will pause when I get to some of the bigger illustrations, and I'll show them to you as we go along. Make it more like reading a fairy tale to you guys tonight. All right, A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. The monster showed up just after midnight, as they do. Connor was awake when it came. He'd had a nightmare. Well, not a nightmare. The nightmare. The one he'd been having a lot lately. The one with the darkness and the wind and the screaming. The one with the hands slipping from his grasp, no matter how hard he tried to hold on. The one that always ended with, "Go away," Connor whispered into the darkness of his bedroom, trying to push the nightmare back, not let it follow him into the world of waking. "Go away now." He glanced over at the clock his mom had put on his bedside table. 12:07. 7 minutes past midnight, which was late for a school night, late for a Sunday, certainly. He told no one about the nightmare. Not his mom, obviously, but no one else either. Not his dad in their fortnightly or so phone call. Definitely not his grandma, and no one at school. Absolutely not. What happened in the nightmare was something no one else ever needed to know. Connor blinked groggily at his room, then he frowned. There was something he was missing. He sat up in his bed, waking a bit more. The nightmare was slipping from him, but there was something he couldn't put his finger on, something different, something... He listened, straining against the silence, but all he could hear was the quiet house around him, the occasional tick from the empty downstairs or a rustle of bedding from his mom's room next door. Nothing. And then, something. Something he realized was the thing that had woken him. Someone was calling his name. Connor. He felt a rush of panic, his guts twisting. Had it followed him? Had it somehow stepped out of the nightmare and... Don't be stupid, he told himself. You're too old for monsters. And he was. He'd turned 13 just last month. Monsters were for babies. Monsters were for bedwetters. Monsters were for... Connor. There it was again. Connor swallowed. It had been an unusually warm October, and his window was still open. Maybe the curtains shushing each other in the small breeze could have sounded like Connor. All right, it wasn't the wind. It was definitely a voice, but not one he recognized. It wasn't his mother's, that was for sure. It wasn't a woman's voice at all. And he wondered for a crazy moment if his dad had somehow made a surprise trip from America and arrived too late to phone and, "Connor." No, not his dad. This voice had a quality to it, a monstrous quality, wild and untamed. Then he heard a heavy creak of wood outside, as if something gigantic was stepping across a timber floor. He didn't want to go and look, but at the same time a part of him wanted to look more than anything. Wide awake now, he pushed back the covers, got out of bed, and went over to the window. In the pale half-light of the moon, he could clearly see the church tower up on the small hill behind his house, the one with the train tracks curving beside it, two hard steel lines glowing dully in the night. The moon shone, too, on the graveyard attached to the church, filled with tombstones you could hardly read any more. Connor could also see the great yew tree that rose from the center of the graveyard, a tree so ancient it almost seemed to be made of the same stone as the church. He only knew it was a yew because his mother had told him, first when he was little to make sure he didn't eat the berries, which were poisonous, and again this past year when she'd started staring out of their kitchen window with a funny look on her face and saying, "That's a yew tree, you know." And then he heard his name again. Connor. Like it was being whispered in both ears. "What?" Connor said, his heart thumping, suddenly impatient for whatever was going to happen. A cloud moved in front of the moon, covering the whole landscape in darkness, and a whoosh of wind rushed down the hill and into his room, billowing the curtains. He heard the creaking and cracking of wood again, groaning like a living thing, like the hungry stomach of the world growling for a meal. Then the cloud passed, and the moon shone again on the yew tree, which now stood firmly in the middle of his back garden. And here was the monster. As Connor watched, the uppermost branches of the tree gathered themselves into a great and terrible face, shimmering into a mouth and nose and even eyes peering back at him. Other branches twisted around one another, always creaking, always groaning until they formed two long arms and a second leg to set down beside the main trunk. The rest of the tree gathered itself into a spine and then a torso, the thin, needle-like leaves weaving together to make a green, furry skin that moved and breathed as if there were muscles and lungs underneath. Already taller than Connor's window, the monster grew wider as it brought itself together, filling out to a powerful shape, one that looked somehow strong, somehow mighty. It stared at Connor the whole time, and he could hear the loud, windy breathing from its mouth. It set its giant hands on either side of his window, lowering its head until its huge eyes filled the frame, holding Connor with its glare. Connor's house gave a little moan under its weight. This would be a good place to pause for the picture. And then the monster spoke. "Connor O'Malley," it said, a huge gust of warm, compost-smelling breath rushing through Connor's window, blowing his hair back. Its voice rumbled low and loud with a vibration so deep Connor could feel it in his chest. "I have come to get you, Connor O'Malley," the monster said, pushing against the house, shaking the pictures off Connor's wall, sending books and electronic gadgets and an old stuffed toy rhino tumbling to the floor. A monster, Connor thought, a real, honest-to-goodness monster, in real waking life. Not in a dream, but here, at his window. Come to get him. But Connor didn't run. In fact, he found he wasn't even frightened. All he could feel, all he had felt since the monster revealed itself, was a growing disappointment. Because this wasn't the monster he was expecting. "So, come and get me then," he said. A strange quiet fell. "What did you say?" the monster asked. Connor crossed his arms. "I said, come and get me then." The monster paused for a moment, and then, with a roar, it pounded 2 fists against the house. Connor's ceiling buckled under the blows, and huge cracks appeared in the walls. Wind filled the room, the air thundering with the monster's angry bellows. "Shout all you want," Connor shrugged, barely raising his voice. "I've seen worse." The monster roared even louder and smashed an arm through Connor's window, shattering glass and wood and brick. A huge, twisted, branch-wound hand grabbed Connor around the middle and lifted him off the floor. It swung him out of his room and into the night, high above his back garden, holding him up against the circle of the moon, its fingers clenching so hard against Connor's ribs he could barely breathe. Connor could see raggedy teeth made of hard, knotted wood in the monster's open mouth, and he felt warm breath rushing up towards him. Then the monster paused again. "You really aren't afraid, are you?" "No," Connor said. "Not of you, anyway." The monster narrowed its eyes. "You will be," it said, "before the end." And the last thing Connor remembered, was the monster's mouth roaring open to eat him alive. Breakfast. "Mom," Connor asked, stepping into the kitchen. He knew she wouldn't be in there. He couldn't hear the kettle boiling, which she always did first thing, but he'd found himself asking for her a lot lately when he entered rooms in the house. He didn't want to startle her, just in case she'd fallen asleep somewhere she hadn't planned to. But she wasn't in the kitchen, which meant she was probably still up in her bed, which meant Connor would have to make his own breakfast, something he'd grown used to doing. Fine. Good, in fact, especially this morning. He walked quickly to the bin and stuffed the plastic bag he was carrying down near the bottom, covering it up with other rubbish so it wouldn't be obvious. "There," he said to no one, and stood breathing for a second. Then he nodded to himself and said, "Breakfast." Some bread in the toaster, some cereal in a bowl, some juice in a glass, and he was ready to go, sitting down at the little table in the kitchen to eat. His mom had had her own bread and cereal, which she bought at a health food shop in town, and which Connor, thankfully, didn't have to share. It tasted as unhappy as it looked. He looked up at the clock. 25 minutes before he had to leave. He was already in his school uniform, his rucksack packed for the day and waiting by the front door, all things he'd done for himself. He sat with his back to the kitchen window, the one over the sink that looked out onto their small back garden, across the train tracks and up to the church with its graveyard, and its yew tree. Connor took another bite of his cereal. His chewing was the only sound in the whole house. It had been a dream. What else could it have been? When he'd opened his eyes this morning, the first thing he'd looked at was his window. It had still been there, of course. No damage at all, no gaping hole into the back garden. Of course it had. Only a baby would have thought it really happened. Only a baby would believe that a tree, seriously, a tree had walked down a hill and attacked the house. He'd laughed a little at the thought, at how stupid it all was, and he'd stepped out of bed, to the sound of a crunch beneath his feet. Every inch of his bedroom floor was covered in short, spiky yew tree leaves. He put another bite of cereal in his mouth, definitely not looking at the rubbish bin, where he had stuffed the plastic bag full of leaves he'd swept up this morning first thing. It had been a windy night. They'd clearly blown in through his open window. Clearly. He finished his cereal and toast, drank the last of his juice, then rinsed the dishes and put them in the dishwasher. Still 20 minutes to go. He decided to empty the rubbish bin altogether, less risky that way, and took the bag out to the wheelie bin in front of the house. Since he was already making the trip, he gathered up the recycling and put that out too. Then he got a load of sheets going in the washer that he'd hang out on the line when he got back from school. He went back to the kitchen and looked at the clock. Still 10 minutes left. Still no sign of "Connor," he heard from the top of the stairs. He let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding in. "You've had breakfast?" his mom asked, leaning against the kitchen door frame. "Yes, Mum," Connor said, rucksack in his hand. "You're sure?" "Yes, Mum." She looked at him doubtfully. Connor rolled his eyes. toast and cereal and juice," he said. "I put the dishes in the dishwasher." "And took the rubbish out," his mum said quietly, looking at how neat he'd left the kitchen. "There's washing going too," Connor said. "You're a good boy," she said, and though she was smiling, he could hear sadness in it too. "I'm sorry I wasn't up." "It's okay." "It's just this new round of, 'It's okay,'" Connor said. She stopped, but she still smiled back at him. She hadn't tied her scarf around her head yet this morning, and her bare scalp looked too soft, too fragile in the morning light, like a baby's. It made Connor's stomach hurt to see it. "Was that you I heard last night?" she asked. Connor froze. "When?" "Sometime after midnight, must have been," she said, shuffling over to switch on the kettle. "I thought I was dreaming, but I could have sworn I heard your voice." "Probably just talking in my sleep," Connor said flatly. "Probably," his mum yawned. She took a mug off the rack hanging by the fridge. "I forgot to tell you," she said lightly. "Your grandma's coming by tomorrow." Connor's shoulders sank. "Aw, Mom." "I know," she said, "but you shouldn't have to make your own breakfast every morning." "Every morning?" Connor said. "How long is she going to be here?" "Connor, we don't need her here." "You know how I get at this point in the treatments, Connor. We've been okay so far." "Connor," his mum snapped, so harshly it seemed to surprise them both. There was a long silence, and then she smiled again, looking really, really tired. "I'll try to keep it as short as possible, okay?" she said. "I know you don't like giving up your room, and I'm sorry. I wouldn't have asked her if I didn't need her to come, all right?" Connor had to sleep on the settee every time his grandmother came to stay, but that wasn't it. He didn't like the way she talked to him, like he was an employee under evaluation, an evaluation he was going to fail. Plus, they had always managed so far, just the two of them. No matter how bad the treatments made her feel, it was the price she paid to get better, so why? "Only a couple of nights," his mum said, as if she could read his mind. "Don't worry, okay?" He picked at the zip on his rucksack, not saying anything, trying to think of other things, and he remembered the bag of leaves he'd stuffed into the rubbish bin. Maybe Grandma staying in his room wasn't the worst thing that could happen. "There's the smile I love," his mum said, reaching for the kettle as it clicked off. Then she said with mock horror, "She's going to bring me some of her old wigs, if you can believe it." She rubbed her bare head with her free hand. "I'll look like a zombie Margaret Thatcher." "I'm going to be late," Connor said, eyeing the clock. "Okay, sweetheart," she said, teetering over to kiss him on the forehead. "You're a good boy," she said again. "I wish you didn't have to be quite so good." As he left to head off for school, he saw her take her tea over to the kitchen window above the sink, and when he opened the front door to leave, he heard her say, "There's that old yew tree," as if she was talking to herself. All right, so there's the first 18 pages of A Monster Calls. A little quicker read tonight. Didn't want to spend too long going into the book because it's not that long. I want you to read it for yourself. If you enjoyed what I just read, again, A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, and hope you're having a great summer. I'm going to sign off now. We'll I don't know if we've announced this doing these live readings, but we are still doing the good books list and the giveaways, the book bundle things. We're taking a pause for things like going to Colorado, Estes Park, great place to be, and also the student novel contest, which is coming up in just a little over 2 weeks. So we will resume either in late August or early September. So hope you enjoyed A Monster Calls, and I'll be back with you again next Monday night with another book. Thanks a lot.